every time.
We're men in tights. We roam around the forest looking for fights. We're men in tights. We run from the rich and give to the poor, that's right.
Should Robin Hood steal Nikes from your local Walmart? Hello everyone. My name is Carmel, and I started this channel to talk about the morals and political messaging present in fantasy media. Today, my focus is on the mythical English outlaw Robin Hood. Robin and his mythical merry men lived out in the woods and enjoyed a variety of pastimes like dancing, drinking, and a cheeky bit of grand larceny. Robin Hood isn't just a bow-buckling heartthrob, though. He's also a philanthropist. The reason he's considered a hero and not a rascal is because he gives away his stolen cash to those in need. He's a criminal, but the good, fun kind. Robin's popularity is pretty much evergreen, having starred, appeared, or been parodied in a new movie or TV show at least 5 times a decade every decade since the 1950s. Admittedly, some of those are subpar. Taron Egerton tried his best, but 2018's movie is more convoluted than it is fun. It made a bold attempt at updating Robin to a half-fantasy, half-modern context, and it failed because its metaphors and messaging were ham-fisted, clunky, and inconsistent. Case in point, comparing Robin's time in the Crusade to American troops in Iraq, but doing it for the cool factor rather than for the sake of meaningful discussion. There are interesting ideas in here, as well as some grade A cheesy action, but the two don't really work in tandem. There are parts of the film that I liked, but I can't recommend it in good conscience. However, I do really think there's merit to the idea of a contemporary Robin, not in the "this character is inspired by" sense, in the true sense. Just straight up trying to imagine what a 21st century Robin would look like. We keep revisiting him, I think it's time for him to visit us. So instead of discussing what a modern Robin Hood would look like through the frame of 2018's most confused attempt at political allegory, I'm going to skip to the ending question that discussion would lead us to. What would modern Robin Hood do? If he was real and currently running around in the 21st century, who should he rob from and who should he give to? Let's begin. A lightning fast part 1. Which Robin Hood? Like I mentioned, Robin Hood's story has been retold in hundreds of different books, over 50 films, and nearly as many parodies. Instead of trying to pick a singular case or make a comparative analysis of a handful, I'm going to use a distilled synthesis of sort, an aggregate average of Robin for whom we can assume the following. He's an English outlaw who takes from the rich nobility and gives to the poor because he views his government as illegitimate, greedy, and cruel. The details might blur, he may be a man, a fox, or a superhuman, but that's what Robin does, and what he believes. Part 2. The Moral Dilemma. If we're being honest with ourselves, we don't just love Robin for his philanthropy. We also love that he metes out justice. The Sheriff of Nottingham is the most infamous bad cop in all of fiction, and it's cathartic to watch Robin outwit and outfight him. Robin's not just taking on other low criminals, he's punk enough to tackle the kind of scum who've armed themselves with a false sense of legal legitimacy. We like him because he's a sexy man, fox, or superhero who breaks the rules for the right reasons. He punishes the cheaters and rewards the cheated, which means in essence, there's no moral ambiguity to what he does. But were he alive today, he'd have very few tyrannical monarchs to steal from. The British majority seems to like their queen, most of Europe lost their noble houses to revolutions, and America has had no king since Michael Jackson passed. So is there anyone out there today Robin could steal from that acts as the satisfactory target? Someone who the law won't touch. Someone the world has no traditional answer to, some villain who can't be addressed by any other means than grabbing your friends, grabbing your green tights, and grabbing their shit. Part 2a. Theft in the Modern Day. Unlike feudalism, our system only rewards those who labor and innovate, right? Sweat, blood, and tears turn hard work and networking into 100% ethical fortunes. So theoretically, there's no unfairness, no modern King John for Robin Hood to steal from. Well, I don't think that's how it turns out in practice. While I don't have a King John to talk about, I do have a modern-day knight to use as a hypothetical. He's the 25th richest person in the world according to Forbes, Phil Knight. Phil Knight grew up in middle-class circumstances. He studied hard, worked his way through high school and college, was a successful athlete. He served in the military, worked as an accountant, and eventually became a college professor. Being a particularly bright fellow, he realized that Japanese manufacturing turned out products of equal quality to German manufacturing at a much lower price. Of his own initiative, Mr. Knight flew to Japan to secure distribution rights. He started out rough, literally selling the Japanese-made shoes out of the back of his car. From those humble origins, he built one of the most well-known and admired companies in the world, Nike. His current net worth is estimated to be $36 billion. He's one of the most visible cases of the American dream coming true. Hard work and smart business sense skyrocketed Mr. Knight into a giant of industry. And to make the whole deal better, he's a hell of a philanthropist. He's donated over $2 billion to date. He's everything an aspiring entrepreneur dreams of being. So why would anyone ever consider it fair, righteous, or morally sound to steal from this guy? Where's the justice in that? Despite the cult of adoration surrounding the guy, his story isn't that simple or that clean. Beginning in the 1970s, Nike started sourcing its product from sweatshops that used abusive practices and child labor to keep production costs low. In 2001, Todd McKean, Nike's director of compliance at the time, described Nike's early attitude as follows. Our initial attitude was, hey, we don't own the factories, we don't control what goes on there. Massive protests in the 90s, done by organizations such as United Students Against Sweatshops and Team Sweat, forced Nike to adopt a code of conduct and finally start conducting audits on the factories that sourced its shoes back in 1999. Which means that the first 3 decades of Nike's meteoric rise were built on the backs of workers who were cheated from fair pay, safe working conditions, humane hours, or even their whole childhoods. Over the past 20 years, Nike has received a lot of praise for promising to make incremental changes and stop abusing and stealing money from workers all over Asia. Personally, though, I'm very skeptical of congratulating the company for abusing fewer victims while still maintaining record profits every quarter. After all, you'd never catch me having a conversation that goes like this. Hello there, Cousin Kevin. I'm calling today to chat about how Passover went. I'm really thankful that this year, all you did was shove Grandma down the stairs and shit on the Seder plate. While those are 2 very atrocious actions, that's still 3 travesties less than last year. Thanks for not stabbing anyone this time. I look forward to seeing you at the next Seder, and great job with the harm reduction. In the same way, I'm not going to thank Nike for stealing, hurting, and abusing less than they used to. The ideal amount of human rights violations in your supply chain should be 0. Apologists will tell me that global trade is complex, and I don't disagree, but that's a hurdle to overcome, not an excuse. Even if the change has to come about incrementally, it turns out Nike hasn't actually made the incremental changes it's been vocal about for the past 20 years. The company is provably dragging its feet because everyone involved profits from doing so. My proof? The Clean Clothes campaign, working with, and you'll have to excuse my terrible French, the Collectif Éthique sur l'Étiquette, have made repeat reports on the aggressively anti-worker policies that Nike engaged in. For the sake of brevity, I'll be summarizing their 2018 report, but you can find the whole 30-page thing linked in the description below. The report states the following. A. Nike is pulling production from China in response to the rising cost of labor. The company has abandoned factories that offer living wages to their workers. B. In terms of the price of a pair of Nike shoes sold to the consumer, the workers' share has fallen by 30% between 1995 and 2017. C. In Indonesia, Cambodia, and Vietnam, where these brands have shifted most of their sourcing, incidents of human rights violations are more prevalent, and workers' average salaries are 45 to 65 below the living wage, that is to say, largely insufficient for workers to meet their families' most basic needs. This deliberate effort to reduce labor costs has helped Nike double its revenue in the past 10 years. Nike is making more money than ever, and a smaller and smaller portion of it goes to the workers who produce the garments. Nike's corporate board has consciously shifted their production to factories that perpetuate poverty abroad. Further, half of these factories do not comply with overtime policy, union rights, or even health and safety norms. Further, the report uses the leaked Paradise Papers to outline Nike's routine tax evasion practices, Nike skips out on 600 million euros in taxes annually. This would be enough money to pay above poverty wages to 250,000 workers in Southeast Asia. But that's not what the money is being used for. All of this cash, instead, is handed to shareholders and athlete sponsorships. This isn't just a oops, didn't mean to kind of situation. Nike has spent decades rebranding their image as a conscientious company working hard on improving the conditions in their factories. And yet, here we are. Nike, once again, is siphoning money from the hands of the global worker and into the pockets of some of the wealthiest folks in the West. So with 50 years of stealing from the needy despite promising not to, I've got to ask, is Phil Knight really all that different from the evil King John? King John stole from the serfs, Phil Knight steals from the factory workers. If anything, Phil Knight's global operation makes King John look like a total amateur. Not to mention that Mr. Knight is actually real, which makes him the certifiably worst of the two. Does Phil Knight fulfill the Robin Hood criteria then? If not the man himself, where could we draw the arbitrary line? Would we agree it's admirable and heroic to steal from the Indonesian factory owners, who are the ones perpetuating the abuse? If that's the case, would Robin be justified in stealing the money from the coffers of Nike's corporate accounts, which grow through doing business with these abusers? How about from Nike's executive and management, who are the ones who made a decision to source their product from immoral suppliers? Would Robin Hood be justified in stealing from everyone who owns a share in Nike? Where does the buck stop before it's no longer moral for Robin to yoink it? Part 2b, and this isn't just an overseas problem. While obviously better off than sweatshop workers, many Americans still deal with injustice at the workplace. Millions of American service workers lose 10 to 20% of their paycheck to wage theft every year, which means that even made-in-America fortunes are amassed via cheating and stealing. Here is a not-so-fun set of statistics. Yearly reports from the FBI indicate that all property crimes total between $13 to $16 billion a year. Meanwhile, the EPI reports that corporations steal about $15 billion in minimum wage violations alone. It's harder to find a reliable source for money stolen in overtime violations, rest break violations, and off-the-clock violations, but that leaves the EPI's $15 billion as the bottom floor for the amount of American labor stolen every year. Even at the most conservative measurements, American bosses steal as much money from their workers as American criminals steal in cash, cars, and jewelry every single year. Part 2c. This isn't even a secret. Many American corporations receive repeat fines for stealing from their workers. Shamefully, the court-ordered payouts or arbitrated settlements are always smaller than the amount of money stolen. I won't dive into the numbers to keep this video from running 2 hours long, but I'll leave an investigative report linked in the description. This report, to be clear, only covers cases where wage theft was taken to court and succeeded, excluding complaints made by parties who couldn't afford to legally pursue their employers. This is just the easy-to-prove stuff on public record. The report condemns the ineffectiveness of the current penalty system, which has not deterred repeat offenders. Companies like FedEx, Bank of America, AT&T, and CVS eat the fines and re-offend again. Walmart is king among this gaggle of corporate thieves, having lost or settled at least 98 times in the last 20 years. No matter how many times the corporate hand is caught in the cookie jar, it always comes back to steal more, because the money they make is more than the money they lose. The law is pathetically incapable of punishing or preventing theft on this monumental scale. The Walton family has amassed a $200 billion fortune over decades of constantly plundering wages from their workers. They escape justice because it's the company's managers and accountants who steal, not the family personally. But the company isn't a person. The fruits of the crime are enjoyed by the shareholders, and none more so than the Waltons. So, do the Waltons satisfy the Robin Hood criteria? Is it time to don our bicocket hats and raid Nike shoes off Walmart shelves? Part 3. Seeking Answers. Even if Robin's most recent adaptations have been subpar, his iterative descendants can be found in just about every style of media. Think Green Arrow, Locke Lamora, YouTube's Sherwood original. Considering the modern state of things, I can see why Robin is still so prevalent. why he's still lovable and still resonates. Most of us aren't winning the game. Most of us could list a handful of morally repugnant winners who make us feel like we're getting swindled. After all, there's plenty of billion-dollar villains whose despicable behavior offends you the most. Is it Nike, Nestle, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, Trump, Comcast, Uber, EA, Facebook, Purdue Pharma, Google, Cambridge Analytica, Betsy DeVos, Eric Prince, Royal Caribbean Cruises, Disney, Hollywood Accounting, the record industry as a whole, Epic Games, Tesla, Quicken Loans, Sprint, Mike Airlines, Marlboro, Apple, Walmart, BP Oil, Equifax, Pearson, McGraw-Hill, Sinclair Broadcasting, The Diamond Drain, Monsanto. Whew. Yikes. There sure seem to be a lot of liars and cheats on the board. Hate my opponents though I might, I'm not brave enough to master the bow and grow a Van Dyke beard in an effort to overturn the game board. And please, for your safety and mine, don't take this video as a license to go on a crime spree. Or at least if you must, it was Limrak who sent you, not me. Beyond personal safety and freedom, there's another barrier to the conclusion of, yup, doi, just steal. In the modern era, Nike and Walmart are insured. They won't feel the loss. The individual store workers and low-level managers will face discipline and dismissal over the theft, but the policy-setting executives will come out just fine. Unless Robin really swung for the fences and started raiding overseas tax havens, in most foreseeable modern cases, he'd be able to give to the needy, but would have a hard time bringing villains to justice. And that leaves me rather dejected. I like Robin Hood. If he stepped out of a time machine and onto my lawn, I'd like to be able to offer him words of wisdom on how to succeed. How to be the sexy man, fox, or superhero he's always meant to be. Part 4. Words of Wisdom. Well, I'm a hobbyist, not a professional philosophizer. So I asked around and read around trying to see if I could find an answer. How do we get justice these days? My father took an interest in my pet project and suggested that I read Robin Hood Justice by Robin Hood Took from the Rich and Gave to the Poor, and We Should Too, by Jeppe Von Platz. Past his cool name, Von Platz also had some really cool things to say. Things that got me to consider Robin Hood as an archetype for modern justice, not just a fun character. Von Platz argues Robin's actions are bigger than just stealing from bad guys and giving to good guys. Robin Hood's justice is actually a reparative response to systemic injustice. That's a lot of fancy words. Let's break that down. Part 4a. One wrong, one fix. Most modern court systems practice a form of something philosophers and legal scholars refer to as reparative justice. As Von Platz defines it,
the main concern of reparative justice is to repair the moral relationships that were damaged by past wrongs, and thereby reconstruct proper moral relationships. Its main requirement, accordingly, is that we repair past wrongs.
Reparative justice is focused and specific. If Party A committed a crime by wrongly damaging Party B, then Party A should face punishment in proportion to the harm done. Once Party A pays for its wrongdoing and apologizes, the past wrong is repaid, the moral relationship is repaired, and Party B should, in an ideal world, be satisfied. In my very reductive shorthand, one wrong, one fix. Robin's actions are similar on a surface level, but are not the same as reparative justice. His actions address the outcomes of King John's unfair governance and make sure the poor have enough to eat. But he has no intention of repairing the moral relationship between King John and his citizens. He doesn't attempt to stop the monarchy from reoffending again. He also doesn't match specific peasants to specific amounts of money stolen from specific tax collectors who stole. Robin indiscriminately steals and broadly distributes. Part 4b. Many needs, one fix. And that sounds a lot like another set of philosophies of justice, collectively called distributive justice. This series of theories seek to consider how to properly distribute resources in society in the fairest way possible. Here are a few different styles of distributive justice, as defined by Von Platz, so you get what we mean by that.
1. According to the principle of sufficiency, it is unjust that some have less if we can avoid it without sacrificing anything of vital importance.
Here, justice is achieved if resources are distributed so that everyone has enough, and no one has to sacrifice too much to attain that goal.
2. According to the principle of priority, justice requires maximizing the position of the least well-off.
Here, justice should specifically allocate its time and effort first and foremost to those most in need. It's only fair that those who need more help get more help.
3. According to the principle of utility, we should seek the distribution that maximizes utility. By the theory of marginal utility, a dollar, or pound, is worth more to the poor than to the rich, so taking from the rich and giving to the poor often increases net utility.
Here, justice should care more about creating positive outcomes. The better the outcome, the more just the action is. All of these principles are competing ways of trying to make the world a fairer place. Each attempts to posit a solution to widespread suffering. In my shorthand, many needs, one fix. Robin's actions are adjacent to such lines of thought, because ultimately Robin wants to end widespread suffering and need because that need and suffering are caused by wrongful action. He's a direct response to an element of active malice, so there's still an element of reparation in there too. Part 4C. Let's make like the Beatles and put it all together now. Jeppe Von Platz argues that Robin Hood's justice, in a sense, splits the difference between the forms of justice described above. See, King John and the Sheriff of Nottingham aren't going around and stealing the money themselves. Local lords, barons, merchants, law enforcers, thugs, and snitching neighbors are all working in unison. The whole system of Anglo-Saxon society is working in concert to distribute the wealth unfairly, pushing King John and his cronies up and the peasantry down. Robin Hood stealing from the rich and giving to the poor is counteracting the unfair effect of the whole unjust system. To continue my use of oversimplification, Robin Hood is engaged in the following. Many wrongs, one fix. Though it's not a permanent fix as much as it is an ongoing one. Robin Hood doesn't seek to change feudalism, he just seeks to make it fairer. So long as the money is distributed unfairly, he will continue to steal from the rich and give to the needy. Part 4D. Robin Hood Justice in the Modern Era. Jeppe Von Platz's paper extrapolates this idea forwards, seeing it as a necessary form of justice for the modern day. The unfortunate truth of money is that it isn't fairly doled out. Everyone is touched by the unfairness, either visibly or invisibly. When I say visibly, I mean the kind of unfairness that you can grasp at a moment's notice. Anyone who's born rich clearly hasn't done a thing to earn it. Someone who's hit by an uninsured driver made no mistake, but will be buried in medical debt as a result. The restaurant owners whose businesses will close due to the pandemic couldn't have planned for such an extreme contingency, and it's not their fault that the government's response has been coming up catastrophically short. When I say invisibly, I mean that as follows. Unfairness that isn't clearly visible to outsiders who don't experience it. African Americans were legally barred from amassing generational wealth. Individuals with disabilities have to spend effort and money overcoming obstacles the rest of society never has to consider. LGBT people are much more likely to be cut off from family or community support, as well as much more likely to experience discrimination in the workplace. And unfortunately, when I mentioned those things, certain cisgendered, hetero, able-bodied white men in the audience will get defensive. They'll say things like, "I had it tough, too." They'll list valid examples. Maybe they were born into deep poverty. Maybe they lost a parent to the opioid epidemic. Maybe they've been robbed blind by loopholes in their medical insurance. They'll demand that the victims of injustice should simply work harder to overcome their troubles and stop whining. And to them, my response is, advocacy is the hard work meant to overcome these troubles. The difference between your proposal of knuckling down and dealing with it, and our proposal of speaking up and dealing with it, is that speaking up doesn't just help ourselves, it helps everyone. And furthermore, if you do feel like you've been unjustly screwed by the system, let me extend this olive branch. Come join us. We will fight for you too. The only requirement is that you take the time to listen to marginalized people and stop denying the truth of modern bigotry. You have a lot more to gain from fighting with us than fighting against us. Part 5. What Von Platz suggests. Because so much injustice, visible or invisible, still plagues society, Jeppe Von Platz argues that no fortune is morally clean, and no misfortune is inseparable from the trauma at its roots. The modern world and all of its systems are unfair. There is no purely ethical production or consumption to engage in. In all cases, the distribution of wealth is tied to injustice. And we can blame who we like and defend who we like. But at the end of the day, the blame game and the I earned it game shouldn't become a distraction. There are many wrongs, and Robin Hood has shown us a fix. Justice demands that we take some from the rich and give to those in need. Understandably, his paper argues that we should do so without resorting to dangerous capers, only surviving through grit and panache. Robin Hood's justice, or the distribution of unjust wealth,
should be pursued through legally and politically available means. Hood-style vigilante corrective actions of robbery and kidnapping might have been justified in the past, but are impermissible now that it is possible to correct for the unjust distribution through the operation of a constitutional democracy. Corrective measures could be of the Robin Hood variety, but suitably stripped of its outlaw component. Robin Hood justice could be pursued by taking from the rich and giving to the poor through progressive taxation of income, wealth inheritance, and bequests.
Part 5b, what I suggest. In essence, I do agree with Von Platz that Robin Hood justice should be implemented in our society. There's nothing in his essay I necessarily disagree with. Taxing the rich to implement strong safety nets and social programs will better the position of the downtrodden and answer some of the injustice they have faced. I do, however, think that I lean significantly more radical than Von Platz's essay does. Robin Hood justice, while necessary to help the downtrodden, is only a response to past and present injustice. Robin Hood, in his traditional iterations, is not an anti-monarchist. He understands that King John the Usurper is evil and fights against that evil while waiting for King Richard to return and be a goody-goody nice king. In the same way, Von Platz's essay seeks ways to counteract injustice, but does not provide a solution to it. Von Platz gives a very important inch, but I would propose we all take a mile. As well as redistributing wealth, I think it's important to restructure workplaces and production chains to be fairer in the first place. Unions, cooperative business models, and workplace democracy are all important tools to help workers defend themselves and get their fair shake without needing an outside force like the government to act on their behalf. The kinds of changes I'd like to see, however, won't appear across the board overnight. Setting up proper workplace power structures will be a long, dragged-out fight that we will have to repeat industry by industry, factory by factory, store by store. I see Robin Hood justice as a worthy opening gambit, a strong move to give most working folks the ground to stand on. Further, while the stories of Nike and Walmart have put my focus on unjust workplaces specifically, I don't think it should stop there. Robin Hood justice should be used to offset the injustice done to everyone. Means testing or gatekeeping such measures would render them both pointless and cruel. All of these side-by-side projects, however, will require a lot of effort. The history of civil rights and labor rights paints a pretty clear picture. Voting is not nearly enough. Agitating, organizing, unionizing, and protesting were the primary methods the public used to push reform past unwilling politicians. We'll have to continue and expand such efforts if we want to see a healthier, more just world. That's the only way we stop issues such as the rampant wage theft and exploitative manufacturing I outlined above. While that's not the fun answer, I do think it's the right answer. So long as the modern world distribution of resources is so deeply tied to active and historic injustice, we should use all available tools to correct for that unjust distribution. Well, all tools other than literal Robin Hood tactics. I want to be dead clear, you and I should not be going about committing robbery, burglary, and fraud. As fun as that sounds, it's not going to bring about positive change, and it's only going to endanger yourself and others. If you're going to get arrested, let it be for protesting. Part 6. So that's what you think we should do, but what about Robin? The original questions I posed were, who should Robin Hood rob in the modern day, and who should he give to? What targets could you and I point him at because we decided that Jeppe Von Platz's advice is reasonable, but not fun? What I love about the answer that I believe we've arrived at is that it's honestly been there right under our noses all along. Robin Hood's motto is rob the rich and give to the poor, and that on its own still holds up perfectly. No asterisks, parentheses, or proper nouns required. All modern wealth is unjustly distributed. Go ahead and steal some of it back. Jeff Bezos? Sure. Warren Buffett? Of course. Elon Musk? Go right ahead and steal his Twitter account from him too. Bill Gates? As it turns out, despite all of his charity work, that guy earned his wealth by being an immoral and monopolizing bastard. Go ahead and steal from him too. In closing, I wouldn't discourage Robin from stealing Nikes from the local Walmart, but I'd tell him to dream just as big as he always has. To continue doing what he's always done, I'd tell him, second verse, same as the first. Rob from all the rich and give to all the poor. Part 7. Final Thoughts. I began reading up on Robin Hood and formulating this essay in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's since escalated and become much worse due to massive mismanagement, so I hope that you listeners are safe, sound, and finding the support that you need. Instead of the usual pitch for the rest of my content, I think it's more appropriate to shout out the people on the front lines of this catastrophe. José, the collaborating artist for this video, suggested Doctors Without Borders. This organization advocates and provides medical care for those in dire need all over the globe, even at great personal risk. It's impossible to succinctly summarize all the good work that they do. If, during these troubling times, you have some money to spare, consider Doctors Without Borders. Link to their website in the description below. Part 8. That's that? Indeed it is. See you next time.
Toodaloo. Au revoir. Auf Wiedersehen. Ciao.